few American artists have incited more controversy than Thomas Hart Benton. Argumentative, brilliant, and enormously influential, Benton painted for nearly 70 years, inspiring acclaim and loathing among students, friends, fellow artists, and outraged critics. His work is strongly associated with the Midwestern United States, the region where he was born, and which he called home for most of his life. He also studied in Paris, and lived in New York City for more than 20 years, where he painted scores of works, and scenes of the American South and West. Benton painted murals that were visually striking, and carried a strong social message. Through them he inspired Americans to overcome the challenges of their times, particularly during the dark days of the Great Depression. Thomas Hart Benton was born in 1889, in the small Ozark town of Neosho, Missouri, into an influential family of politicians. He had two younger sisters, Mary and Mildred, and a younger brother, Nathaniel. Benton was named after his famous great-uncle, who became a political legend in Missouri, serving between 1821 and 1851 as the state's first U.S. Senator. His mother was Elizabeth Wise Benton, and his father, Colonel Maecenas Benton, a lawyer and U.S. congressman, who served as a Democratic politician representing Missouri from 1897 to 1905. Benton spent his childhood shuttling between Washington, D.C. and Missouri, and when his father went out campaigning, Benton went with him. By the time he was 10, he knew all about political rallies, camp meetings and backwoods hotels. In Washington, when his father took him to the house, he'd sit there for hours sketching the congressman. In 1905, Colonel Benton was defeated, and the family returned to Missouri, where Benton attended high school. In 1906, at age 17, Benton started drawing cartoons for the Joplin American newspaper. Benton longed to go to art school, but his father disliked the idea. He agreed, however, to allow him to attend school at the Art Institute of Chicago, if his son completed 1 year at the Western Military Academy in Illinois. Benton lasted 3 months before the school sent a letter to his father, declaring it was not the right place for him. In 1907, Benton began classes at the Art Institute of Chicago, but found he did not fit in well. He attended whatever class suited his fancy. When drawing from the model, he worked in unorthodox ways using pen or pencil rather than charcoal, sketching rapidly, and frequently changing his position in relation to the model. He was unruly, and alienated many of his peers and his teachers. He was expelled once for fighting in the classroom, but was readmitted shortly afterward. Benton created this self-portrait at the Institute in 1907. It is one of 13 of his works that are currently owned by the Institute, providing a glimpse into his artistic evolution at that time. After 2 years pushing the boundaries of what the school expected of him, Benton convinced his mother to support a move to Paris, where he believed he would receive the training and artistic environment he required, and deserved. He studied in Paris for 3 years, briefly at the Académie Julian, and for a longer period at the Académie Colarossi, where he could work independently. While there, Benton was greatly inspired by the works of American painter Stanton MacDonald Wright, the founder of the synchronist style of abstract painting, which was based on the concept that color and sound have much in common. In 1911, Colonel Benton decided he could no longer support his son in Paris, so Benton immediately returned to the United States, spending a short time in Missouri, before convincing his father to allow him to settle in New York City. By 1912, Benton was working as a portraitist in New York. He was financially independent, though struggling. Fortunately, in 1913, a portrait of his sister Mildred was reproduced in Collier's magazine, providing him with his first significant publicity. More importantly, his friend from Paris, MacDonald Wright, had organized a synchronist exhibition in New York City, and Benton was represented, showing an abstract composition, constructivist still life. Unfortunately, Benton's paintings weren't selling, so in 1914, he began work as a set designer and general handyman, painting backdrops for the silent movies being produced near New York. He said later that the experience gave him the skills he needed to produce his future large-scale murals. Between 1910 and 1920, he experimented with many styles. He was greatly influenced by the compositional strategies of Cézanne, but for most of the time, he was a dedicated modernist, although he was largely unsatisfied with the results of his efforts. He became an active member of the avant-garde, exhibiting color abstractions at the Forum Exhibition of Modern American Painters in 1916, and at the Progressive Daniel Gallery in 1917 and 1924. Unfortunately, a fire destroyed most of the examples of Benton's paintings and early experimentation from this period, and few survive today. When America entered World War I in 1917, Benton was quick to sign up. He knew he wanted to stay off the battlefield, so he joined the Navy. This was a period of relative ease for the young artist. Never one for hard labor, or following orders, he managed to land a comfortable position drawing sketches of the naval bases and ships, for documentation purposes. He was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, and began detailing the camouflage of ships entering the harbor. He also made illustrations for a catalogue of ships and military equipment. This requirement for realistic documentation strongly affected his later style. After the war, Benton struggled to find his artistic identity. Around 1920 he moved away from avant-garde art, declaring himself an enemy of modernism. This painting, The Cliffs, shows both the influence of Benton's precise naval work and the sweeping movement shown in paintings typical of the synchronist movement that had attracted him earlier. In his works around 1920, Benton tried to construct authentic American art using only American images and themes. He was one of the first American artists to effectively combine aesthetic ideas from modernist painting with reverence for regional realistic subject matter. People of Chilmark, shown here, is an early example of what would become Benton's regionalist style. Here, he focused on the American environment, specifically the natural beauty of Martha's Vineyard, in the fishing and farming area of Chilmark, where the artist and his wife summered each year. In 1922, Benton married Rita Piacenza, who had arrived in New York City in 1920, and became one of Benton's students. Rita's family was not supportive of Benton, as they were convinced that an artist would never be able to financially support a family. The couple persevered, and remained married for 53 years, having 2 children together. In this work, painted in Martha's Vineyard, Benton stands bare-chested alongside his wife, in a self-portrait which is a somewhat startling figure subject for the early 1920s. Rita later took an active role in Benton's career, handling all of his business affairs, so that he could focus on his art. In the early years of their marriage in New York, Benton and his wife had very little money. Earlier, Benton had been in the habit of destroying most of the works he completed, but Rita, believing in her husband's talents, carefully saved his paintings, and showed them to dealers around the city in the hope of making a sale. In 1924, Benton traveled to Missouri to help care for his father, who was dying of cancer. The experience of reconciling with his estranged father, and listening to old friends who came to visit at the hospital, stirred up a longing to reconnect with his rural upbringing, and to see the backwoods of America. After his father died, Benton returned to New York, but he became increasingly disillusioned with the art scene there. He decided to travel around the country, to capture the daily life of Americans at work and play. His first sketching trip lasted for 2 months, and began in the spring of 1926. Benton traveled from New York to the Buffalo River area in northwest Arkansas. Rambling about the backwoods of Newton County, Benton experienced a lifestyle largely unchanged since the 1890s. He sketched farmers working in their fields, church meetings, boys swimming, children in schoolhouses, and life around the town square. He stayed at the homes of farmers, and at backwoods hotels. He later wrote an article about his experiences for the July 1934 issue of Travel magazine. The trip was significant in the development of Benton's artistic style. From then on, he tried to capture the American experience in a manner that made his art accessible to the mainstream public, an approach that put him at odds with other artists and critics. His work was derided by some as cartoon-like, isolationist, jingoistic, and stereotypical. Others felt his work was original and full of energy. Between 1920 and 1928, Benton worked from time to time on a self-commissioned mural project, the American Historical Epic. It was his earliest attempt at the kind of large-scale public murals for which he would become famous in the 1930s. Although he had no building in which to house the project, Benton planned to create a series of 75 mural panels, covering the entire history of the United States, from its discovery through to the 1920s. Most mural painting of the period featured heroic or allegorical figures, and was somewhat flat in effect. By contrast, Benton's idea was to be modern, both in subject matter and style, to portray a modern type of social history in a visual language influenced by Cubism. The first 5 of Benton's paintings, Discovery, The Palisades, Aggression, Prayer, and Retribution, are what Benton called Chapter 1 of his epic. 2 other chapters follow, but are not shown here. Benton, who sympathized with leftist ideologies, saw the project as a people's history, and included many scenes of racial and economic conflict. In his epic, Benton employed stylized whites, blacks and Indians to challenge conventional accounts of American history. With their strangely elongated bodies, exaggerated proportions, distorted physical features, and intensely sculptural presence, Benton's monumental figures are powerful formal inventions, but also startlingly and unmistakably American. Politically motivated, the scenes of the epic are related to the racially charged citizenship debates of the late 1910s and early 1920s. But it is the white, black and Indian figures that reveal Benton's rethinking of American history and the role of race within it. The nation's most familiar historical themes, discovery, religion, westward expansion, are recast to confront the racial inequities and violence embedded in the popular experience of these histories. 14 of the completed panels were publicly exhibited in New York between 1923 and 1928. However, the murals did not lead to a commission for Benton, and he never sold a single panel from the series. After nearly a decade of work, he abandoned the project. In 1926, Benton created designs for the history of New York, to fit 4 unfilled spaces on the 3rd floor of the New York Public Library, areas that had been designed for mural paintings, but had never been filled. The construction scene, titled Modern New York, was one of the first mural themes with contemporary working-class subject matter to be painted in America. This is an early sketch for the panel, which Benton significantly reworked before he arrived at his final composition. In February of 1927, he exhibited his 4 completed panels to considerable fanfare at the New Gallery in New York City. Articles in praise of the paintings were published by Benton's friends. Despite the press attention, however, the library's trustees refused him the commission, and the finished panels remained unsold during his lifetime. They are now in a private collection. During the 1920s, Benton developed his own style of down-to-earth realism, celebrating rural life but also satirizing city life. His portrayals of Midwestern people and landscapes were marked by rhythmically undulating forms, and plasticity of movement, stylized features, cartoon-like figures, and brilliant color. Benton's vision of modernism was firmly rooted in figuration. He often explored themes of U.S. history, centering African Americans in those shared narratives. Benton began championing working-class people in his paintings and murals. He took pride in his Midwestern roots, and began painting ordinary Americans, not often shown in art. Benton's style of painting made common people heroes. He gave them large bodies with lots of muscles, and painted them using deep, rich colors. Benton also painted villains in his pictures. The villains were usually rich and powerful people that got ahead by taking advantage of others. Benton's sympathy was with the working man. His works often show the melancholy and desperation of working-class life. They are commentaries on societal injustices, often focusing on the plight of farmers in the industrial age. One often hears politicians speak of the voice of the people. Benton attempted to keep this popular voice alive in his artwork. In 1928, on another sketching trip, Benton traveled from Pittsburgh, through the coal fields and hardscrabble farms of the Smoky Mountains, down into the cotton belt of the Deep South. There he turned inland, first exploring the delta of the Mississippi River, and then pushing westward as far as the ranches and oil fields of New Mexico and Texas. During his journey, Benton made hundreds of sketches of steel mills, hillbilly shacks, cotton pickers, river boats, railroad trains, sleepy streets, cowboys, and oil towns. He would draw upon these scenes for the remainder of his career. Benton observed everything he could about ordinary American life, and recorded what he saw in his sketches. He also built small clay models, or maquettes, for each painting. Then he painted his scenes using his clay models as a reference. In 1928, an exhibition held at the Delphic Galleries in New York of 109 pieces of his work, based on his journeys, immediately established Benton as a leading chronicler of American life. A reporter from the New York Times praised the show, finding it particularly stirring. This was the type of review Benton had been craving. His aim had always been to develop a true American art, without European influence. In 1926, the New York Art Students League hired Benton as an instructor, a post he held for 10 years. Benton was an admired teacher who offered students grounding in European art history, as well as an awareness of European modernism. While there, Benton taught some of the early practitioners of abstract expressionism. Among his students was the young Jackson Pollock, who began taking life drawing, painting, and composition classes around 1930. He continued these studies for over 2 years. Unknown to the other students, Pollock had gained special attention and private tutoring from Benton, who wanted to encourage him in his art. Pollock's approach to his compositions was influenced by Benton's art. Many of Pollock's early paintings and sketches, created in his classes with Benton, show Pollock's continued efforts to organize compositions using the methods Benton had demonstrated. Pollock later claimed that he learned what to rebel against from Benton's teaching. Despite his declaration, the teacher and student were close. Pollock spent a lot of time with the Benton family, even joining them on their vacations to Martha's Vineyard. He was invited back regularly until 1935. In 1934, Pollock posed for Benton's painting The Ballad of the Jealous of Lone Green Valley, as the figure playing the mouth harp in the foreground. This work is typical of Benton's devotion to sound and music making in his painting career. Elements of synchronism are evident, such as the radiant layered halo connecting the man and wife in the background. In 1935, Benton was offered the job of director of the Kansas City Art Institute, and he decided to return to the Midwest. Pollock was devastated by the news that the Bentons were leaving. They had been like family to him. According to a friend, when the Bentons left, Pollock was truly a lost soul. He took to heavy drinking, and even spoke of suicide. In 1930, José Clemente Orozco, the famous Mexican muralist, was commissioned to create a mural for the dining room of the New School for Social Research in New York City. Outraged that a foreigner should be favored over an American, one of Benton's friends went to the director of the new school, Alvin Johnson, and arranged a commission for Benton as well, a mural called America Today, for the building's boardroom. Since there was no budget for such a mural, Benton agreed to execute the project for no pay, except for the cost of the materials. He was also paid $500 for teaching at the new school that winter, and the Whitney Museum bought all the preliminary sketches for the work. Offering a panorama of American life throughout the 1920s, America Today is a room-sized mural made up of 10 canvas panels. Some of the panels are devoted to the Deep South and the Midwest, and all of the subject matter came from Benton's travel sketchbooks. In this work, Benton sought to document the hard-working people of the rural landscape who were responsible for making their own way in the world. Those that were forgotten and victimized by the changing modern and mechanized economy of the early 20th century. The mural joyfully celebrates an America before the full impact of the Great Depression. Here, a multiracial labor force busily build the city. This in itself is a modern and utopian idea because labor was heavily segregated in America at that time. The design includes high skyscrapers, which were markers of the new modern city, urbanism, and industrialism. The presence of a ship reminds us of New York's prominence as a port city. Benton applied molding to the canvas, to separate one vignette from the other, which gives a modern feel to the picture. His rapid compositional shifts in depth, between the foreground and deep background, are similar to cinematic effects. Standing in front of the monumental and brightly colored image, one senses the city pulsating with new energy. The mural is now part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art collection in New York City. Not everyone approved of America Today. The conservatives didn't like Benton's use of contemporary subject matter, and the radicals were furious that Benton had not expressed a Marxist viewpoint in his work. As a young man, Benton's background in Missouri populist politics and his reading of authors like Bernard Shaw had made him sympathetic to anarchist and socialist ideas. He had briefly flirted with Marxism, but by 1928 he had lost all faith in it, and from then on, called it a joke. By the 1930s, he was a liberal Democrat who supported Roosevelt's New Deal. In 1930, during the depths of the Great Depression, the director of the Whitney Museum commissioned Benton to decorate the library of a building on 8th Street in Greenwich Village that had been purchased for the purpose of promoting contemporary American art. Benton's response was a 5-part series called The Arts of Life in America, providing him with the second most complex project of his emerging career. His earlier mural, America Today, had portrayed America at work. His new work, The Arts of Life, described America at play. The mural consists of 4 huge wall panels, and 4 more around the ceiling. These panels depict the arts of everyday life, music, games, dance, and sports. They also show regional diversity, unemployment, crime, and political nonsense, giving us a glimpse of life in the 1930s. Benton set out to create an inspirational series of canvases that would give the viewer an understanding of the nature of American creativity. He concentrated on depicting the art forms of major divisions of the country, the South, the cities, and the West. Benton also painted a historical section devoted to Native Americans. The unusual style of his work made it a challenge for viewers to understand the meaning of his paintings. While Benton explained his style of realism was how he thought of his subjects, viewers often saw his figures as satirical, and his subject matter as too crude to be represented in art. When the murals were completed, many critics praised them for their vibrant colors and originality. Others condemned them as being decadent and outrageous. They referred to the energy in all his figures as showing tremendous physical tension. The artist, who was somewhat outspoken, reacted by condemning anyone who did not agree with him. There was fierce debate, and Benton began to be seen as one of the most famous and influential artists of the 1930s and 1940s, and the first to have his image shown on the cover of Time magazine. The mural was sold to the New Britain Museum of American Art in Connecticut in 1954, when the Whitney moved to a midtown site. Benton had his big break in 1932. A relative unknown, he won a commission to paint the mural of Indiana life, planned by the state for the 1933 Century of Progress exhibition in Chicago. The mural, A Social History of Indiana, is made up of 22 large panels, spanning 250 feet in total, representing the social, economic, and cultural history of the state of Indiana. Benton interviewed residents of the state before starting on the large project. From his conversations, he was surprised to find events he had not expected, such as the prominence of the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana, and a miners' strike called Terre Haute. These things were discussed so often that Benton decided to include them in his mural. In Indiana, 30% of adult males were estimated to be members of the Klan, and in 1924, KKK members were elected as governor and to other political offices. The KKK reached its peak membership in 1925. The mural, exhibited at the World Fair, brought heavy criticism because of the inclusion of the KKK. But it didn't stop the work from being one of the most popular attractions. Midwesterners were thrilled to see a representation of themselves in art. Benton himself described the murals as a dream fulfilled. Benton had only 63 days to paint 232 feet of completed canvas, which shows his hard-working intensity, mastery of the medium, and organizational skills. The mural was donated to Indiana University in 1940 and installed across 3 buildings on the campus the following year. Some people thought Benton was too outspoken about politics and art. Many Americans, however, truly admired his work and ideas. The left-wing current affairs weekly magazine, Nation, honored Benton with their 1932 award for the Outstanding Production for the Year in American Art. More recently, Indiana University students circulated a petition calling for the removal of the mural panel depicting the KKK. In the hope of ending the controversy, without removing the mural, the university administration said it will use the room containing the mural for activities other than classes. "It is our obligation to stand firm in defense of artistic expression," they said. "Covering the murals feels like censorship and runs counter to the intent of the artist to make visible moments in history that some would rather not acknowledge." But these events did happen. In 1934, Benton's fame was publicly recognized when he was featured on the cover of Time magazine, an honor never before granted to an artist. From then on, Benton became known to the public as the leader of what was called the regionalist movement in American art. To Northerners, regionalism was viewed as small-minded provincialism. From a Southern perspective, however, it was seen as a just reaction to the mechanized urban sprawl to the north. Regionalism developed during the 1930s, and along with its ethical cousin social realism, formed part of a broad movement known as American scene painting. The style struck a popular chord with many people, and offered a positive antidote to the gloom of the Great Depression which was ravaging the country. Although Benton was considered a key figure in regionalism, artists Grant Wood and John Stuart Curry were also important practitioners. Each believed that the rural areas of the South and Midwest of the country should be recognized as the true source and strength of American art. During the 1930s, regionalism became the unofficial style of the Work Progress Administration, a program introduced in 1935 by then-President Franklin D. Roosevelt to provide jobs and income to the growing population of unemployed in the United States. The Department of the Treasury in the early 1930s demanded that all federally funded murals which were being created for post offices nationwide required the artist to visit the locality to assure local content, and that they must produce an American scene. In 1935, Benton received 2 offers, an invitation from the Kansas City Art Institute to head their painting department, and a mural commission for the Missouri State Capitol in Jefferson City. He agreed to the Art Institute position, and he and his family moved from New York to Kansas City. The city and the school welcomed him, and were excited at his arrival. At the same time, Benton was commissioned to create a mural for a lounge in the Missouri State Capitol building in Jefferson City. With a focus on the individual as well as the local, Benton's mural included 235 individual portraits. He was paid $16,000 for the work, which was completed in 1935. The mural crosses three walls of the large rectangular room. The north wall depicts pioneer days and early settlers. The east wall displays politics, farming and law in Missouri, and the south wall exhibits scenes from St. Louis and Kansas City. Each wall is divided by a marble doorway, an architectural framework that Benton used to segment scenes of Missouri life. The mural focused heavily on the experiences of the working classes and farmers from the early settlement era to the dispossession caused by the Great Depression in the 1930s. The artist was forthright about his intention to paint what he saw. Most of the mural's contents originated from sketching trips around Missouri, and many of the individuals and scenes portrayed within were derived from his life experience. In his mural, Benton presented the working man as the driving force of society, while highlighting the inequities that arise with the proliferation of industrial technologies and city living. He showed African Americans and indigenous Americans being exploited by slave traders and settlers. He also included Kansas City infamous corrupt political boss, Tom Pendergast, and a woman in the foreground cleaning her baby's bottom, perhaps implying something grubby going on in Missouri politics at the time. These issues were considered controversial, and some called for the mural's destruction. A few years after, when Pendergast was arrested for tax evasion, someone took it upon themselves to add his prison number to the figure in the painting. At the top of each door, Benton featured Missouri mythologies. These are Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, Jesse James's Railroad Stick-Ups, and the tragic story of Frankie and Johnny. In his treatment of the love story, Benton freezes the drama and its actors in mid-action as the gun at center fires a bullet. The bright note of orange at the center of the picture focuses the viewer's attention on the pivotal figure that creates the tumultuous action within the canvas. Benton long depicted racial and ethnic minorities within his works, and at times was accused of creating racially stereotyped facial features. Viewers often question Benton's views toward African Americans, given his caricatured depictions of people of color, and his propensity for harsh commentary about people and institutions, regardless of their racial background. A social history of the state of Missouri includes imagery of a lynching and a slave auction. Artistically, Benton seems to have believed that his crude realism and candid subject matter captured American life more satisfactorily than his modernist contemporaries. Benton believed he was shining a light on the negative aspects of Missouri history and its continuation of indentured servitude, at a time when many artists did not paint people of color at all. To Benton, the people of Missouri were the main stars of the work, a view which still angered some of the public, who claimed there were not enough famous Missourians included in the painting. Benton committed much of the next decade to mounting a defense of the mural, which he considered completed the last phase of his development as an artist, and that it was the best work of his career. In the late 1920s, Benton began to produce limited edition lithographs. Prints held a particular attraction for him, as the relative affordability of the medium matched his desire to make art available to as many viewers as possible. The majority of his nearly 100 lithographs were printed in editions of 250 by Associated American Artists Galleries, based in New York. They sold these prints by mail, and in department stores, and Americans were able to buy signed Benton prints for as little as $5. This business model brought art collecting to middle-class consumers, while also providing a source of income for the artist in the midst of the Great Depression. Works by acclaimed artists like Benton could be owned by the very people he wanted to represent. Benton worked closely with the lithographer to create the image, by drawing the picture onto the lithographic stones. Lithography was well suited to Benton's work, as the process can reproduce the fluidity of the drawing and the tonal nuances required. Benton never produced etchings or worked in color lithography. Nor did he hand color his lithographs, as other artists did. In 1937, Benton published his autobiography, An Artist in America, which was critically acclaimed. The writer Sinclair Lewis said of it, "Here's a rare thing, a painter who can write." An Artist in America describes Benton's life and thoughts, his tumultuous role in the art world, and his plans for further glory, all with the bravado of an artist at the height of his renown. By the mid-1930s, Benton may well have been the most famous artist in America and, if we are to believe his storyline, probably the best paid. His book is a travelogue of the country, respectfully describing Main Street America, in the manner of a politician, championing the values of the common people. Part of the point of the book was to show how good the author was at getting along with everybody, no matter what their station in life. Benton was rough and ready. He could drink with gamblers and parley with wealthy art patrons. He had had girlfriends and now a wife. He had been to Europe but knew that America was best. And he could paint. His autobiography was republished twice, in 1951 and 1968, and in each, Benton appended a new last chapter to bring readers up to date with his life and work. And to vent. Like the mountain music he loved, the rowdy life of American artist Thomas Hart Benton had the larger-than-life quality of folklore. His reckless behavior, heavy drinking, profanity, and belligerence toward any artist who took a different stylistic or ideological path scandalized people from New York to New England to Missouri. Benton made enemies easily. It was not his art that caused offense, but his abrasive personality. Over the years he opposed abstract painters, curators, homosexuals, intellectuals, Harvard, New York City, Kansas City, women, and old friends. He was compelled to measure each person he met, and each idea he encountered, against his own idea of the world, distilled from his egomania, pragmatism, and a good dose of populism. Despite Benton's growing recognition and success, he was continually at odds with the New York art world. He hated its elitism and pretentiousness, and in return, the critics savaged his work. In 1935, Benton, then at the height of his fame, took the opportunity to write an article in which he denounced the New York critics who had previously spurned him. The critics, quite frankly, prefer that artists don't speak for themselves, he said. They prefer a guy like Jackson Pollock, who was completely inarticulate. Then, the critics have perfect freedom to say anything they like. In 1937, Life magazine commissioned a large painting from Benton on the subject of Hollywood, even paying for him to take a trip there over the summer of that year. His famous painting, Hollywood, was completed in 1938. When Life magazine first saw the work, they immediately disapproved and wanted nothing to do with it, but the popularity of the work changed their tune, and they eventually included it in their spread about Hollywood. Throughout the rest of the 1930s, Benton continued to create notable works. He frequently transposed biblical and classical stories to rural American settings, including controversial nudes of the mythological Greek goddess Persephone and an interpretation of the biblical story Susanna and the Elders. His painting Persephone was considered scandalous by the Kansas City Art Institute, and was borrowed by the showman Billy Rose, who hung it in his New York nightclub, the Diamond Horseshoe. The painting is now held by the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. Benton reset the biblical tale of Susanna and the Elders within rural America. This work demonstrates the difficulties of painting religious imagery in a contemporary context. Susanna is shown bathing, unaware of the two lecherous men who spy on her. In this scene, the men discuss their plan to blackmail the young maiden, hoping to be rewarded with sex. Benton's frank and realistic treatment of Susanna's body breaks with the long painterly tradition of the classic female nude. The picture was considered radical and shocking to audiences at the time. In 1941, after publicly making tactless remarks about homosexuality, Benton lost his position at the Kansas City Art Institute. With his strong ego and stubbornness, Benton became a rather isolated figure, and enemies frequently attacked his work for being vulgar and unpatriotic. Despite Benton's occasional frustrated and disenchanted comments about Kansas City, that it did not have the potential to be an artistic center rivaling New York as he hoped, Benton stayed there, and lived at the same house for nearly 40 years. In the late 1920s, Benton had begun to play the harmonica, and hang around New York's Greenwich Village with musicians and musicologists. A gifted musician, he collected folk tunes, played the harmonica on a professional level, and invented a new form of musical notation for the harmonica that is still used by music publishers today. Benton's son, Thomas, better known as T.P., was himself an accomplished musician, and spent time as the first flutist with the Orlando Symphony Orchestra. In 1942, the family released a recording on Decca Records called Saturday Night at Tom Benton's. Accompanied by the American Chamber Music Group, T.P. played flute, and Benton played harmonica. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, bringing the U.S. into World War II. Shortly after, Benton decided to paint large-scale propaganda paintings to awaken Americans to the evils of fascism. In just 6 weeks, he produced 8 works in a series he called The Year of Peril. His plan was to hang the works at the busy Kansas City's Union Station to jolt the travelers and commuters who passed by into awareness of what was happening to them. His overriding objective was to portray America's enemies as genocidal maniacs. Here, a craven giant with Asiatic facial features tills a field of death as he casually tosses skulls onto a bloodied landscape. While the paintings made a big impact, they were deemed unsuitable for propaganda purposes and were soon forgotten. Benton's Year of Peril provides us with a glimpse of the American state of mind at the beginning of World War II. In the late 1940s and early 50s, painting styles changed, and abstract expressionism shook the art world like an earthquake. And, like an earthquake, it left a number of institutions in shambles. Among the ruins were the American Regionalist and Social Realist schools, and the American Abstract Artists Group, whose members had dominated the galleries and museums at that time. The Realists especially saw all of their most cherished beliefs about art upended. Art no longer needed to address the common man. The new art was concerned only with color and formal problems of art. Some artists jumped ship and became abstractionists. Others slogged on and hoped for a change in the winds of the art world. Benton could no longer lay claim to being one of America's vanguard artists. Abstract expressionism was taking hold as the new force in the art world. Devoted dealers continued to display the works of the realists, for what was becoming a niche audience. But, for most art enthusiasts, it was as though an entire school of artists had mysteriously died. Books on 20th-century American art reinforced that impression by highlighting these painters' work in the 1930s, and never again. In 1951, Benton wrote, "For nearly 10 years I lived in a generally continuous glare of spotlights. Like movie stars and baseball players, I became a regular public character. I signed my name for armies of autograph hunters. I was continuously photographed and written about by the columnists. I received fan letters by the hundreds. Some of them, not so polite. And now? It's all gone." Benton remained active for another 30 years, but his later works generally lack social commentary and are nostalgic views of the pre-industrial Midwest. Benton was elected into the National Academy of Design in 1954 as an associate member, and became a full member in 1956. In 1961, he was chosen as one of 50 outstanding Americans of meritorious performance in their fields of endeavor, to be honored at the first annual banquet of the Golden Plate, in Monterey, California. In 1957, former President Harry S. Truman's staff was looking for an artist who could paint a mural for the Truman Presidential Library and Museum in Independence, Missouri. The project was offered to Benton, who accepted. In some ways, Benton was the perfect choice. He was Missouri's greatest living artist. His style was more or less realistic and accessible to ordinary people, and his murals were usually on historic subjects. Benton worked closely with Truman on designs for his mural, Independence and the Opening of the West, and his commission led to a developing friendship with Truman that lasted until the former U.S. president's death. In 1958, the New York Power Authority commissioned Benton to paint a 7 feet high by 20 feet wide mural for the public visitation area of the New York State Power Authority at Niagara Falls. The mural took 6 months to paint, after a year of research. It depicts early explorer, Father Louis Hennepin's first view of Niagara Falls in December 1678. Father Hennepin is flanked on the right by members of the explorer René Robert Cavalier, Sieur de La Salle's advance party and Indian allies. To the left are the Seneca Indians. Also among his other late career murals are Trading at Westport Landing, for the River Club in Kansas City, and Joplin at the Turn of the Century, for the city of Joplin, Missouri. In 1973, when Benton was 84, he was persuaded to come out of retirement to paint a mural for the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum in Nashville, which turned out to be his final work. Among the vignettes depicted are a barn dance, women singing church music, a white woman with a dulcimer who sings Appalachian ballads, and an African-American man strumming the banjo. Stylistically and thematically, Benton's last work has all the elements of his regionalist works of the 1930s. Benton was completing the mural when he died of a heart attack. He was 86 years old, and still living in Kansas City, Missouri. His wife Rita died 10 days later. Benton's ashes were buried beneath a tree on a property in Martha's Vineyard, where he and his wife spent their summers. Today Thomas Hart Benton is best known for his realist depictions of American life, which, in his own time, were perceived as directly opposed to modernist movements cultivated in Europe. His paintings, largely vignettes of daily life, and ordinary rural characters, were both praised for their frankness, and criticized for their gritty representations of American culture and history. Benton's main contribution to 20th-century American art might be his emphasis on images of ordinary people, and common law. His expressive realism stands out for its exaggerated curvilinear forms and shapes, and bold use of strong colors. By shifting attention away from New York, and towards the Midwest, Benton expanded both the scope of possible artistic subject matter, and the potential public for American art. Practically all major American museums have at least one Benton painting, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Whitney Museum, Dallas Museum of Art, and the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. Thomas Hart Benton's contribution to American art cannot be overstated. Through his vivid depictions of the American Midwest, and his impactful murals, Benton has left an indelible mark on the American artistic landscape. His work remains a powerful reminder of the role of art in capturing the essence of a time, a place, and its people, making him a pivotal figure in the story of art in America.